I'm Simon Baddeley, and I'm Jack Hargreaves' stepson. And I was born in 1942 in Clavering in Essex on my grandmother's farm, Mill End Dairy Farm. And I met Jack, who became my stepfather, in 1948 when I was rising six. And he came to live with my sister Bay and my mother Barbara.
Now, I think anyone that knows Jack now thinks of him as somebody that saw this great difference between town and country and almost equated that with the difference between past and future. So can you just explain in your own words, as someone that obviously knew him well, what Jack was about?
Well, he was an extremely cosmopolitan person. He'd traveled to many places in the world and worked in the media and in the entertainment business. He had wanted to be a vet, but his father ran out of money and had to tell him that he couldn't keep him at veterinary school. And so his first job was in Soho, working on writing copy for Spratt's dog food. And he was very familiar with the life of the city and Soho. But from the moment I met him, we were never very far away from the country because we were always going from the 2 floors that we had in a house in Battersea, down either by train and later by car. This has been in 1949, 1950, to go fishing. And my first encounter with Jack's love of the countryside was sitting with him as he fished and tried to teach me to do it, which I never did. I learned a lot of things from Jack, and one of them was not fishing. Well, I learned a lot about it, but I didn't actually do it. So that all my early encounters with Jack were with his work in Fleet Street, his work in advertising, his work in television later on. And I think he brought to his love of the countryside, and you have to go back to his adolescence to see some of the roots of that. Basically, he was a very troublesome child, and his mother, in despair, he couldn't get on with his father, and his mother, in despair, sent him to a farm in Aylesbury, and where he stayed during the summer holidays and wanted to stay there forever, and loathed having to go back to school, and disliked the whole process of what his father wanted, which was that he should, like his brothers, become a doctor. So becoming a veterinarian was a compromise, that at least he would be doing something medical. But his whole background before the war, as well as during and after, was about technology, about media, about propaganda, in the case of the work he did on Lord Montgomery's staff, on General Montgomery's staff, in the run up to D-Day and after that, right up to the end of the war. I don't know if that's giving you some sort of impression of that. I mean, what I suspect it would do is to say, when people say Jack Hargreaves, the genuine countryman, no, the countryside was the saving of Jack. He loved the countryside. He had great pain from what he saw happening to the life that he had come across at the farm in Aylesbury, and really spent the greater part of the end of his career, the last and most successful part of his career, over 40 years, talking about the countryside and taking his cameraman, Stan Brayo, lovely man, into a whole variety of different places to show people in a way that would probably be impossible now because the change has been so great, what farming life was like, what agricultural life was like, and myriad rural trades.
In fact, one of the main things I've taken from watching Jack in these old Southern TV or Channel 4 remakes of these out of town programs is he's capturing the very last of something as it's sort of fading away. But let's just go back to, because I find it fascinating that a lot of Jack's experience is rooted in this World War II work with Monty. What was he up to in the run up to D-Day? Because this was a crucial moment in the Second World War, wasn't it? I mean, the Russians had been absolutely begging the Americans and the British to get their feet onto the continent. Finally, we did it in the middle of 1944. And of course, the war was quite soon finished by then. But it was absolutely crucial that once those soldiers got over to Normandy, that they didn't then get kicked straight back into the Channel, because the Germans, the Nazis, had been expecting us to do that.
Well, I think it was very clearly understood that, well, we talked earlier about intelligence, but that how you presented yourself to the enemy, and indeed to your own allies and troops, was an absolutely vital part of, as it probably always has been, the issue of morale. But Jack didn't actually want to go into, what's it called, Lynn, when you're in an occupation in war where you've...
Protected.
Not protected. Lynn's father wanted to sign up to go to action. Instead, he was forced to go into mining because that's what they thought he was good at.
No, that's what he'd done before.
And it's what he'd done before. It's a something occupation that was part of the war effort, and a very good job he did too. Jack went initially into the Royal Artillery as a private and then an NCO, and then he went into, he was called up to go to Sandhurst, and he was commissioned into the Royal Tank Regiment. And it was while he was doing work in the Royal Tank Regiment in the UK that some bright spark in the War Office said, we need people who are brilliant at communication. And Jack had already been enormously successful in radio, in doing programming work in radio. He was far younger than most of the people he worked with, and he knew all the great stars of the 1930s, radio stars, and he organized lots and lots of programs in all sorts of very innovative ways. And he was known in the 30s, having moved from his job writing copy for Spratt's Dog Food and working in radio. So he was picked out and joined Montgomery's staff. Now, what Jack would say, it sounds awfully good. I was on General Montgomery's staff. General Montgomery had 15,000 people on his staff. It was all these people, they in many cases called in from civilian life to bring their talent and specialisms to the war effort in a total war. And so what Jack got involved with was broadcasting to the Allies and to the enemy. And as I understand it, it was partly broadcasting techniques, and it was partly about, reserved occupation. That's right. It was he was basically eventually called into reserved occupation because of his skill in the media. Now, what he did specifically, I still don't really know. Paul Peacock says that one of the great successes of he and colleagues that he worked with was to make the song Lily Marlene, sung by a German who actually disapproved of Nazism and came to England, and it wasn't the person that you might think it was, but to make it so popular on the airwaves that it was being sung by the Germans. And Goebbels absolutely detested it because it undermined the war spirit. It was about nostalgia, about a longing to go home and thinking about someone that you loved at home. Very often that's the food of trench soldiers and ordinary grunts' feelings about war. It's wanting to get home and thinking of your family. But Lily Marlene became tremendously popular amongst the lower ranks of German soldiery, even though the higher ranks, including in Berlin, didn't like it at all. And that would be possibly one of his singular successes, no doubt with other people, is to broadcast that so often that it became really popular.
When Jack got into broadcasting on television in the 1970s and 80s, he, I think, possibly because of all this work that he'd been doing previously too in Fleet Street and broadcasting, he seemed to have, I think, almost uniquely natural demeanor in front of the camera. I remember also he doesn't really seem to use script at all. He's just talking off the cuff, which is something which is almost unheard of today. I think, this is, for me, is something absolutely crucial. I want to see somebody on my television screen that is talking off the cuff, naturally, without reading a script that's written by somebody else, possibly, thousands of miles away. And that's one of the aspects of him. So what happened with Southern TV? Because I think there was a whole load of series he did based down in Hampshire for that ITV franchise, but then somehow those got lost and got remade for Channel 4. Is that right?
Well, you were talking about Jack's spontaneity and naturalness in front of the camera. So can I just say something about that and then come to stuff? Jack once said to me long, long ago that he had learned more sociology and psychology from a job that he had at some time selling Encyclopedia Britannica door to door. And I think one of the trickiest things is cold selling because of the rejection. I mean, you know how people feel about Jehovah's Witnesses. I always invite people in. I love discussing theology and going through the Bible. But that's another thing, is that he was obviously brilliant at selling encyclopedias and the hope that they carried of education, aspiration. And he said, you learn so much about what people wanted for their children, about how they hoped that perhaps by investing, because it was an expensive, very expensive thing that you had to buy through constant payments. And you had to sign people up to buy one volume at a time. And it added up and added up. And he said that really taught him about families and people. And I suspect he learned even then that this off-the-cuff chatting and listening to people was one of the most interesting and exciting ways to relate to other people. But of course, he had an agenda that he wanted them to buy encyclopedias. So Southern, basically, he was working at the NFU, which has an office, or did have an office, in Knightsbridge. And somebody had said on Southern television something that was extremely inaccurate about agriculture and about farmers. And his job as head of communications, I remember being at the meeting, by the way, when Jack was recruited for the NFU by Lord Turner. And we went to one of these rather posh meals at a restaurant in London. And Jack was invited to take over the communications role between the NFU, which was enormously unpopular with farmers at the time, to try and help improve the relationship between the union and the people on the ground.
Well, I think, just to interject very briefly, I think it still is. Farmers I speak to seem to say, well, they're just a kind of finance organisation. They don't really lobby for farmers at all anymore. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. Well, a lot has changed there.
Because the critical agency for dealing with government over farm prices and the price review, which was the budget for farmers, was something that farmers were deeply affected by it, but often didn't know what the heck was going on until it was announced in the press. And one of the things that Jack did was to make sure that there wasn't a farmer in the country who didn't know the results of the price review before they would read it in the paper or hear it on the radio or see it on the telly. And he did a deal with the post office and with various agencies from the post office to make sure that individual letters were written to farmers all over the country explaining what the price review was about. And I don't know now how that went down or how effective that was, but he realized that what was so infuriating was this difficulty the union had with communicating with its membership. And I think any agency would have that kind of difficulty. As you say, probably unpopular still, but how else would you do it? And it was while he was correcting this mistake that he felt had been made in an announcement by an agricultural correspondent on Southern Television, and I don't know the details of it was. He went down and met Roy Rich, who was one of the directors of Southern Television, and more or less gave him a wigging. And Roy Rich, charming, suave, intelligent man, Enjoyed Jack's company. I'm sure Jack did all his PR work brilliantly, and it was obviously a good meeting. I'd love to have been there. And he then got in touch with him a short time afterwards and said, we've got an enormous number of anglers in the southern television area. I think there might be room for a program about fishing. What do you think? And the rest is history.
So that series ran for many years, but then
that wasn't Out of Town.
Wasn't it? Okay.
No, he actually put together a program, and I saw it. I'll tell you the conditions in which I saw it. Watching it in a neighbour's house, because Jack wouldn't have a telly in the house. In a neighbour's house with a 9-inch screen, black and white, watching the first broadcast of Garn Fishing, which was introduced by the theme tune of Louis Armstrong, for whom Garn Fishing is a song. And Jack did that. I'm not sure who did the photography, but there was some location shooting and there was some talking. And Jack was quite nervous the first time he was on air in the studio. And George Egan, who I think was already his director then and stayed with him for many decades after that, he said, my God, I'm talking to 2 million people, or could be. And it was live too. And Jack tended not to get nervous because he was a good talker and brilliant. And
well, that was one of the great things about early TV, was the lack of relying on all this pre-recorded stuff. This is one of the things I quite liked about radio.
Yeah, so you could say kill the Queen or use the F word or God knows what, and it would go out to 2 million people.
Yeah, and also, but you needed people who actually were genuine, spontaneous, and could think on their feet to do it. Nowadays, we've got these sort of people that just read in, turn up and read scripts. But anyway, so what happened with the Out of Town series?
Can I just say what George Egan said to him?
Yeah.
Which was, Jack, I shouldn't worry too much, because actually you're not talking to 2 million people. You're talking to about 2 or maybe 3 people and a dog. And one of them probably is making the tea at the moment and isn't even watching. And for that, Jack, the watchword is that I'm not talking to 2 million people. I'm not on a stage, as it were, although he had great admiration for people who could go into a theatre and talk to lots of people and keep it intimate. But you're talking to this small TV audience, which is sitting at home.
Okay, so what happened with the Out of Town? How do we get to the Out of Town series?
Right, well, Garn Fishing then turned out to be very popular. And Roy Rich said, rather than, no, that's right. He said, well, let's do some more Garn Fishing. And Jack said, no, how about we do some more programs that include fishing, but which are also about the countryside? And that was as I understand it, was the route of what became Out of Town. Yeah,
it's a very different world, I think, in television today. There's very little. It seems there's always some sort of agenda. The managers in TV seem to be they've already decided weeks before at some sort of business meeting what they think is going to bring in an audience. But you do wonder, looking at the massive number of channels there are today, why they don't go back to the old system of just having 1 or 2 or 3 channels, because it seemed to be far better quality back in those days. But so what happened to the Southern TV series? Because I think it was lost. There were many episodes made, but Southern TV lost their franchise. Was that then that all the tapes were lost? Although
you should have been in our house. You were talking about the politics of television. You should have been in our house when Jack was sounding off about the other executives at Southern Television. But remember that he was also an executive. He was assistant director of programs at Southern. He became very soon that. It was the highest rank you were allowed to have if you were also on air. But so he was very much involved in the politics of ITV as well. And the start of ITV. He tended to believe in commercial television. He didn't particularly like the BBC, that he felt was run by the establishment, by a particular grouping of people, and didn't have to make its way in the market. He wasn't a mad market Thatcherite, if you like, but he did believe that television should pay for itself. And therefore
Well, I think there was a general sense that ITV was being much more adventurous, that the BBC was too stuffy, and the attitude amongst the ITV people, certainly in the early days, was we got to give these stuffy old BBC people a run for their money, and they certainly did, and in dragging the audiences away from the BBC. But it's almost like there isn't that much difference between many of these different channels now. I mean, like Sky and things like that. But anyway,
the thing is that you queue so many things that I find absolutely fascinating, because we're living in an age where the television's over, broadcasting's over. I have friends who ask me to sign a petition to protect our BBC, and I say, our BBC? Come off it. Jack was predicting this, along with other people, in the 1970s, that there would be multi-channel narrowcasting. Broadcasting to succeed has to have millions of people to watch it. Your audience drops below 2 million, you're in dead trouble if you're going to fund that, or in the case of BBC, justify the license fee. You've got to show that you can attract these sorts of audiences. I got someone, who tells me on YouTube how to change the front lid of a particular brand of washing machine. And he's probably got sort of 150 viewers, and maybe less at times, but they're specialists who are fascinated with how you move the front door of a washing machine, and a million other things. I put 400 quid's worth. I'm not very mechanical. I put 400 quid's worth of spares back on an old bicycle of mine. I love cycling. And I had 3 superb instructional videos which showed me how to handle particular sprockets and circlips that would jump off all the time. Now, people would do that in 5 minutes, but I'd probably take an hour to do it. But I could sit there doing the work on the bicycle with my computer just on my right-hand side, stop frame, look at that, play that back again. And this is what being online is like. We're far ahead of
the drama. I mean, we just don't have the drama. We were making here in Bristol some terrific drama and excellent documentaries, for example, regional documentaries, just not happening. Anyway, let's get back to Jack.
Yeah, well, we're binging on Netflix and you know what.
Can you just give us your thoughts on a couple of memorable out-of-town films that he made for Southern?
Well, to say which were the most memorable, I know that it might be helpful to say, what did Jack give to the British Film Institute? He donated, I think, 5 films to the British Film Institute, which actually we've recovered those, and I'm hoping we're going to be able to use them on a DVD at the moment. Again, there's a technology that's nearly over, but we're going to be able to use them on a DVD. It was about bee skips, the making of bee skips, meeting people who are apiarists but also who understood the craft of making bee skips. Another thing was about, with no location film, about a whole host of farm implements that are no longer needed because of the enormous advances in technology in the farm. I could go on about that for a while. The modern farmer, she's in a cab, air conditioned, with a laptop on the computer, because the combine harvester, which is actually doing the harvesting in a vast prairie field, is actually programmed by sat-nav. So she's not actually having to steer it around the field, which has been very carefully designed to suit the coordinates for what this vast machine can do. So one person, and I mentioned she's probably got a PhD from Agricultural College in a specialist subject, and she's playing with agricultural commodity futures on her laptop, dealing with the harvest that's plunging into the back of the machine, and possibly doing a bit of chat on her smartphone as well with boyfriend, girlfriend, you name it. That's the modern farmer. It's so far from everything that we can imagine about farming, and indeed the sort of farming that is still often put in old MacDonald kind of primary school books about what farming's like, or the kind of farming that children are taken by the teachers when they go to see a petting farm in one of the home counties. Modern farming is so outside the sort of farming that Jack learned about as he grew up, and that even I learned about as I was growing up. So there was bee skips, there was farm implements, and another one, I'm trying to remember, was what is it? It was about the mayfly, in which he managed. I mean, you have to hear about Stan Brayo. Stan Brayo, who was his photographer, explaining the whole process by which the mayfly reproduced itself and lived for a day or 3 days, whatever. And this, I think, won an award somewhere in Switzerland or so. He went to some of these television awards. And you see, the thing about Jack's filming was that it was all done without sound, with the sound added later in the studio, which was very normal in those days. But Jack had once said to Dave Knowles, who is still a friend of mine, and I know him well, who was one of Jack's sound engineers, who added the library sounds to Jack's films. Jack at one point argued with Dave and said, leave the sound off completely, because when people are watching this and listening to me, they're in a sort of daze. Now, and Dave, thank goodness, persuaded him not to do that and put in Atmos and a whole load of brilliant library sounds. But even then, Jack said, don't go into detail. Dave was saying, what's the difference between a chub leaping out of the water and landing again, or a trout rising to a fly, and all the different splash noises? Or what's the different wind noise that you get in willow trees as opposed to oak trees? And Jack said, for God's sake, let the viewer imagine that, just like you or I might when we're reading a book and we fill in the sound and the faces and everything else. The viewers will do that. Let's film on a budget. Let's make it as inexpensive as possible, but of the highest quality. And so
I can remember one of the things he, quite struck me was when he's talking about hunting, which of course is now quite a big contentious issue. It's basically being extinguished, really. And talking about fox hunting, because our generation just think about fox hunting. Of course, hunting never was originally about that, was it? It was actually about hunting for food.
Well, there was venery that the aristocracy did, which was to hunt for deer, wolves, wild boar, and the hare. They were considered honourable enough for the royalty and they had areas that they protected in the most violent and oppressive way from ordinary people being involved. And then with the with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, a whole new body of wealth, the bourgeoisie, began to arrive and wished to follow they bought estates, they bought big houses, and wanted to follow the hunting habits of royalty, well, as aping royalty in all sorts of other ways. And one of the most fascinating things was that the game that royalty had pursued was to eat, as you say. And of course, because it was to eat, that's why they were so violently opposed to those who wanted to share that food. So by those people who poach, so you could be hung for stealing one partridge, one rabbit even. Although rabbits actually were a bit outside that because they were outside what royalty wanted. But the penalties were ferocious. And it's why the Normans refer to the food that they chased in terms of, they call it beef, birth, because they actually ate, it wasn't cows, but and deer were venison, because these were things that they ate and they called them by the names of the meat, whereas the ordinary people would call them by the names of the animals that they were.
So how did we get to the foxes, though?
Well, the fox became something that somebody, I don't know how it actually started, but it became something that could be chased. because it was regarded as a pest, because it killed chick fowl and so on. And as I understand it, fox hunting is only about 300, even 250 years old, and it was spread with enormous success all over the country. Became extremely prestigious and was part of the social life of the country, but and developed all sorts of strict rules and hierarchies and rules and so on. And I hunted a few times in my late teens and early 20s and really enjoyed myself, although we never killed. One of the things about hunting is it's an enormously ineffective way to kill foxes. I think I might have mentioned that to you. I think the reason that the people who dislike hunting with the intensity that they do and helped to bring in the legislation that banned hunting just could not cope with an idea that it might be fun, that it might be exciting, that it might be interesting to ride it headlong across country in all weathers, get covered in mud, enjoy the company of other riders, the horses enjoying themselves as well. I remember the killing of the fox was almost irrelevant to the fact that it was so good to get up early in the morning, saddle up, ride 3 or 4 miles to the meet, maybe longer at times, bloody cold, and then off you go, and the hunting goes on till it gets dark in the winter, and then you come back covered in mud, make sure your pony's looked after and foddered and all the rest, while you're still shivering with cold and longing to be. And anyway, make sure the horse is fine, and then go indoors and have a nice hot bath. And nowadays it would be a glass of malt whiskey by the hot bath, and then sit by a warm fire. Wonderful way to spend a winter weekend.
Jack also did a little program, or maybe a part of a program about the theft of the countryside, as he saw such enormous changes, which were kind of coming to their end in a way at the time he was doing his recordings, and this idea of the money moving into the countryside and actually forcing people who traditionally worked there and were really the reservoir of an incredible amount of crafts out. I mean, we've got obviously the thing now is people just simply buy a home in the country to invest their money in. They may even be living abroad, and it's become almost impossible for young families to get started in the countryside. And we're not just talking about London here; we're talking about all over England now. There's been really a financial oppression of some sort that's stopping these crafts surviving. So if you're just doing a kind of little cottage industry, well, I'm afraid there's someone that's going to make it impossible for you to carry that on, because your overheads are going to be so massive. You've got to pay such a however many hundreds of thousands of pounds for the little cottage in your rural idyll. It's become almost like a kind of theme park, the countryside. So I wonder what you make of your own opinion and what Jack would make of that.
Well, let me tell you an anecdote. As I told you, my roots were in London, even though I was born in the country and spent a lot of time in the country as I grew up. But we moved to an old cottage in Bagnor near Newbury in 1949. And it was 2 cottages that we joined together. One part was a large room that had been used by the Home Guard during the war for parading. And it wasn't a big cottage, it's called Brook House, and it was just near the River Winterbourne in the village of Bagnor. Nearly all the other houses in the village were leased or rented by people. They had no sanitation, so all the water came carried by bucket from the river. We were one of the first people in the village to put plumbing into our house. And there was still a manor house where a family had lived for many years and could be described as the lord of the manor, although they didn't do what might have been their feudal duties about having any kind of sense of responsibility, because I think things were changing already. What the owner of these leased cottages, there were about 10 of them in the hamlet of Bagner, wanted to do was basically to get the people in there out so that they could sell them. Because in the 1950s already, this was becoming real estate because of the people wanting to move out of the country. I didn't know all this at the time. It was unknown to me. I just thought we were living in the country, and I could tell you all about how wonderful and idyllic it was. It was an idyllic idyll. And the people who lived in those cottages were actually longing to get out of them, to escape the insecurity of being in a rental property and go to the high quality council housing, post-war council housing, a few miles up the road on the outskirts of Newbury, where they'd suddenly have full sanitation, very often fitted carpets in all the ground floor rooms and upstairs, central heating, or certainly very good heating, and infinitely preferable to where they were in the countryside with the insecurity and the discomfort of what they were in. And of course, the moment they left, other people came in from a completely different demographic to buy those houses. And I can remember beginning to notice this when the actor Michael Hordern came and bought one of the cottages right next to us. And he'd been an old friend from show business and so on, of Jack's. And he remarked on the people from the town who were coming to live here and said something like, and you came down here a long time ago, Jack, about maybe 5 years earlier. And Jack said, we started the rot. And but have no illusions about the fact that this was somehow an idyll for other people who lived there, that actually farming was changing at an enormous rate. We'll come perhaps to much later, 1977, by which time I wasn't even living in Bagner, but this report by the Nature Conservancy Council in 1977, which signaled the fact that the tension between the needs of the cities and the need to keep down the cost of living signaled a demand for intensified farming that was in complete variance with the need for conservation of nature, or all the things that I remember from the countryside that I knew until we left Bagner in 1960 to go and live near the south coast. So I think that Jack was well aware of that this was a nuanced situation, that actually, I remember him, there was a well-known radio, Howard Marshall, who came down to fly fish on the Lambourne, which was one of the rivers that ran through the water meadows near us. Our river through our garden was called the Winterbourne, ran into the Lambourne. And he went to stay at a pub called the Blackbird, which is now quite a posh little gastro pub in Bagner. And Bagner also has a theatre, and every house is an executive home now worth close to £1 million and sometimes more. And he was in the pub, and he didn't like the cleanliness of the pub. And I think there was sawdust on the floor, and he reported it to the environmental health officers from Newbury District Council, who came in and closed the pub for a month or so. And Jack didn't like that at all. He thought that was utterly wrong. Didn't have any sense that he was a newcomer, but he was also aware of the imbalance in power and the social situations that existed. And I remember talking to an old man who was a lengthsman who cut the verges all along the roads there, lovely rural roads that I used to enjoy riding along and cycling along. And he was still cutting the verges rather than these enormous county council machines that now chop up the hedges along the roads. And he would tell me stories about people being evicted by the landowners, about oppressive rents, all sorts of. He didn't grumble. He wasn't, he was quite a sort of stoic bloke, and he would work away. But I remember Jack saying, you know, that conversation you were having with, and I've forgotten his name now. He said that's how information went around the countryside, because every time somebody came past, he'd have a chat with them and they'd stop for 5 minutes and talk. He might have a drink from his flask and so on. They'd have a chat, and that's how the gossip spread through the man who was cutting the verges. This is only 50 years ago, but it's almost impossible to imagine the changes. But I don't have any kind of rosy glasses about, and Jack didn't either, that somehow the situation was automatically better. There are just different kinds of injustices and different forms of oppression.
I mean, I don't quite see the link between more efficiency in farming and getting rid of those old crafts, because as you know, as you've got the new money coming in, pushing people out, they are actually a reserve of a fantastic amount of knowledge and skills that are leaving to go and live, as you were just saying there, in on the outskirts of a big town. Those rural crafts are lost.
Well, what a Sunak and Trust presenting to the public at the moment, or to the Conservative Party all over the country, is the impossible problem of how to keep down the cost of living without raising taxes. And it's actually impossible to do. And a lot of the people who are listening to this know that's the case, and actually either become helpless. So you see, well, you know this as well as I do, that there have always been changes in the countryside, as long as could be measured, although some changes took place over a gentler pace, but they weren't necessarily gentle. What this Nature Conservancy Council report was drawing attention to, and we mention it in the next DVD that we're mentioning, is that the tension between farming and the requirements of townspeople to produce cheap food is directly contrary to the needs of nature. So I started to see, in the early 60s, lots of dead birds because of all the pesticides that were going down. We started to see winter ploughing, so that the stubble, instead of staying on the fields from November, December, January, February, or you start to put the wheat in, that was being ploughed up for winter wheat. And that is an environment so the destruction of habitat, I didn't notice any of this, but Jack did notice it and was talking about it, and always without being sanctimonious, he said, this is what we did, this is what happened. And he very, very seldom, he never attacked farmers. He did once say, loath as I am to appear to be criticizing farmers, but an awful lot of farming now is rather the same as that kind of plant growing where you get some water and some stones. What's it called? And you grow the plants in the stones. What's it called, Len? When you grow plants in stones in water, and you don't worry about, and you give a little bit of feed and so on. Basically, the soil is not maintained. Basically, you take out everything you can from the soil.
Aquaponics,
that's right. And basically he said that is what's happening, because you basically treat the field as a tabula rasa. You fill it full of fertilizer, you plant your crops, and apply loads of insecticide and herbicide, of course. You work the fields right up to the edges of the hedgerows and so on. So all the hares' corners, all the places where there might be wildflowers and other little habitats that would be suitable for myriad birds and primates and all those things just gradually, disappeared over about 25 years. It happened incredibly quickly because of the enormous demands of the growing population of cities. And
I think you can intensify agriculture without necessarily losing the crafts, is what I'm trying to say. And there's got to be a bit of room for that. I remember we, as our journalists union, we used to have a headquarters called Headland House, which I think we took over some sort of agricultural union, or we bought it off the agricultural union or something, which is this idea of there's always got to be a bit of space at the end of the field for the plough team or the tractor to turn around, and it's actually up along there. That's where you find the union organisers. This spare bit of land. I think they used to call it the waste, didn't they, in medieval times, where, for example, poor could go and graze their cow or their couple of sheep or whatever. The people that had very little, maybe the gypsies.
And that was taken away by enclosures.
Well, the gypsies might bowl up there or whatever. So there's always got to be a bit of wriggle room. In fact, there still is, I think, in large parts of the countryside. But where do you think there are any organisations now that are really taking this preservation of country craft seriously?
Oh, lots and lots and lots of people are fully aware of the tension. I mean, if you take the Sunak Trust arguments that are going on at the moment, I've got friends down the road. When you go to their house, they're in darkness because they don't want to turn the lights on too much. And they're a bit careful about when they make a cup of tea, and they don't have a shower every day, maybe 3 times a week, because the energy bills are just horrendous. We're all right. We're comfortable. We're very careful and watch, but we're not in that category of people who are having to worry every time that the lights get turned on. And so one of the difficulties is the intensity of this demand from people to have cheap food because of the frightening effects of cost of living, its impact. I live in an inner city, Handsworth, in Birmingham, and it's got people trafficking, prostitution, gun crime. You wouldn't believe this because there's some lovely areas around here. We're close to the city centre and there's lots of greenery. Domestic abuse, the list goes on and on. Casual robbery, vandalism, graffiti, rubbish dumping, and so on. All the problems of a society with a very large proportion of people who are living the most precarious lives. And of course, governments are going to be concerned about this. And people that pay the price for this is what we have to do to the countryside, because food, we have to feed ourselves. And we feed ourselves by intensive farming. Now, don't get me wrong, but what I think is happening is we're putting nature onto reservations. And we all know what reservations meant in America, where intending to be humane, Native Americans were encouraged to go on reservations until their land was seen as so valuable by others that the reservation suddenly wasn't the reservation. And there's an endless catalogue of examples where reservations have been impinged upon. So, yes, we do have a lot of areas that are now conserved, where the habitat is attended to, where fledgling birds are recovered under license from the appropriate ministry and brought up in that habitat, first of all in aviaries, maybe in conjunction with a zoo, and then released into these habitats. But these habitats are growing smaller all the time, even though we're paying farmers at times to create habitats that will be, because people, it's very difficult to make a habitat sexy. You know what I mean? It's like you can say, let's save the such and such goose, or let's save the water vole. But if you say, let's save the habitat of the water vole, we might have to kill mink. We might have to stop people fishing as much as they do. We may have to stop this road being built. We may have to stop these farmers extracting water from the river. And we may have to reduce the amount of pollution that's coming from chicken farms that are going into this particular river, which is affecting the life of the river. And all those things impinge on the cost of food in the cities, and therefore on the boat.
Well, we've got this thing called set aside, haven't we? Which I find bizarre, where you've got vast areas of land for many years, year after year, farmers being paid to do nothing with it. That doesn't really sit very well with me. Looking at, and I think many people who've worked in farming in previous centuries would be just gobsmacked to see that sort of activity. But look, one thing which has kind of preserved, because of this horsey culture which we've got now of wanting to have for the kids, a horse, a little paddock, a field, whatever. But I wonder whether, because the replacement, this is one of the big themes in Jack's work, is the replacement of the horse by the car, which he's always kind of gently railing against, and particularly the idea
he relied on the car a lot, and at the same time said, repeated Dr. Joad's remark is that the one thing the human species is going to regret more than anything else is the invention of the internal combustion engine. And of course, as a keen urban cyclist, I don't have a car. I'm aware now that the EU, and now in British regulations, they're requiring electric cars, and they're a problem ecologically as well, but it's a gesture, are being required to have noises attached. They must have tyre noises and engine noises to remind pedestrians and cyclists that they're around. But one of the great difficulties that we're facing at the moment is that we know what we're doing is wrong. We all know the inconsistencies of our behavior. Yeah,
well, I just think with the internal combustion engine, there's been a kind of almost obsession with it since the 1960s, since the shutdown of the railways and the mass production of cars around the world, shipping them in we have, if you go over the M5 bridge here in Bristol, you'll see a vast car park full of imported, mostly Japanese cars sitting there waiting for market. And we managed in my younger years on the 2.5 pence, 3 pence bus ticket, and the bus that came every 10 or 15 minutes, and we just got around very easily on public transport. There's no need for this enormous amount of oil to be used. But anyway, look, back to the horses, because that's what I wanted to kind of get onto there, because this is an area there is still quite a lot of effort by landowners, farmers, and even by people who live in villages and towns and have got a horse for the kids out there somewhere. It does look as if the horses are still going to be preserved, the different breeds and that sort of thing, because it was, it's almost, we're now looking at the possibility of oil, of limitless amounts of energy. Maybe the horse might. I can even remember having a chat to a Birmingham Muslim actually saying, "Oh, in the Quran it says that the horses will return. That we will have. They will be back." So I do sort of wonder about that.
It's a lovely fantasy, and what I find. Let me tell you, I think it's a poignant story. I was born on Mill End Dairy Farm in March 29th, 1942. Enormously protected. I probably had the luckiest, most fortunate and prosperous life, because I was born into the welfare state, when the whole point of the welfare state was that it shouldn't matter whether you're rich or poor, you are part of the welfare state. And this was emphasized very strongly. And so I had good diet, good health care, and in every way, I think I've had the most intense security. The only times I've ever faced danger is when I've fought it on myself by having an adventure and so on. This farm, Mill End Dairy Farm, was started by my grandmother, Barbara Main, who you mentioned before, her husband was in MI6, one of the founding members of the Government Code and Cyber School, a gentleman. He worked at Buckingham Palace, worked as an equerry for the royal family. She was a debutante. They worked in that sort of upper middle class world. And she was very cosmopolitan, breakfast at the Savoy, it was like their local. And she lived this world of dances and social life and found it immensely boring. But that was what a young woman, and then as she grew up, was expected to do. And so one day, sometime in the 1930s, she went and bought, and I've got this on video with my mother, who I thank goodness video talking about how it was explained to her. I've done something very crazy, darlings. come down and see. And they got in their car, because they had a car, which was a rare thing before the war, and drove down to this cottage near Clavering in Essex. And she'd bought a farm, right? And she had Jersey cows on it, which were TT attested, and they all had names. And she was quite modern, because she had automatic milk machines by the time I was around. We used to go down the dairy and get the milk for when I had a cup of tea, because I spent a lot of time at Mill End with my grandmother, and there were bantams in the hedges. It was mixed farming. She had the hay on the few acres of field she had were brought in by Gypsy, the wonderful horse. I got some lovely pictures of that. And they collected the hay, baled it, and so on. And she produced 2 churns of milk every day from this dairy. And some years later, must have been in 1949, 50, when my mum and dad had divorced and Jack and mum were living together. They never got married. Jack was staying on the farm with Bath just overnight. And he said over a cup of coffee, I think after supper, because you know, Bar, that what you have here is a hobby farm. And Mum kicked him hard under the table and he shut up. And later on, he said to me, a milk lorry works its way along these winding Essex roads, picks up 2 churns from your grandmother, picks up 2 more churns up the road, maybe 3 or 4 on the other, and takes them back to a depot where they go through the process of bottling them and distributing them to the farm markets. And your grandmother's farm method of farming effectively puts a penny on every housewife's pint of milk. Whereas what we should be doing, and this is Jack talking, he didn't talk like this later on, is you want to have far larger farms with far more cattle, and there should be strip grazing on highly fertilized nitrogenous parsley, and they should be producing a milk yield infinitely greater than this in order to produce milk at an economic price for housewives. And that's what he took with him to the National Farmers Union, because this was a message, in a way, that National Farmers Union had to do in terms of persuading farmers to adjust their approach to farming or to help them through that process. And it was a terribly tough time. But my grandmother was devastated because she thought she'd left her rather grand social life, rather glamorous social life, where she knew all sorts of famous people and danced to their music in wonderful places and Cafe Royal, Sephora, you name it, to do something useful. And Jack had just said she was a hobby farmer. And I think it was, and of course it was true, but it was dreadful. But I mean, I had this enormously happy life on this farm. I had wonderful memories of childhood that I'll carry to my grave. But it wasn't what farming needed to be in order to produce cheap food, in this case milk, for 30 lovely Jersey cows, all with their names, hobby.
Well, I was chatting to some sheep farmers at the weekend who'd got out of dairy, saying, well, actually, since the early 1990s and the shutdown of the Milk Marketing Board, what we've had is virtually no increase at all in the amount of money per pint or litre that the dairy farmers have been getting for selling their milk to the supermarkets, I guess, and the processors and all these people. So this was quite an important aspect of farming, as being these, what you were talking about earlier about the price setting role of the government, saying, well, you need to have guaranteed prices for these things. So it's become, at least according to them, far more difficult. And you've got to have, hundreds and hundreds of cows in order to actually be able to turn a profit now.
An enormous kind of roundabout being milked. And
the obvious things going on here is this kind of push to industrial agriculture, bigger and bigger, and the small people are being forced out. They'll have to sell up and have some ex-banker buy up their little cottage for a couple of million or something. Money seems to be, almost at the back of all of this. It's slowly but surely coercing the traditional country families out of the country and replacing them with these ex-bankers.
And when we blame capitalism for it, remember what Stalin did to the kulaks.
Which was?
Well, basically, the Russian had these enormous agricultural 5-year agricultural plans, which also required collective farming in order to make efficient, as they saw it, the farming that would feed the cities and allow Russia, one of the most least industrial countries at the time, to be able to industrialize and to buy armaments, among other things, but also to bring wealth to the cities and to create the vast surpluses. The same thing happened in China. The butcher's bill for Chinese communism and Russian communism equals any butcher's bill for capitalism. I mean, we're into a whole other argument here, but this is modernization rather than capitalism or collectivization. But the point is, the kulaks were the people who were seen as being anti-communist because they were peasants who were slightly richer than other peasants because they managed to get a surplus. They had barns and they started doing what farmers everywhere you might be expected to do, which is to have some food over to sell, some food over to tide them over hard times. And basically they were doing exactly what the nasty capitalists were doing. And so they were basically taken away and sent to gulags in vast numbers, whilst the collectivization initiative led to vast starvation because of shortages of food, because collective farming wasn't as efficient as Stalin's advisors had promised it would be.
Yeah, so I think we need to be rather careful with all these things like the common agricultural policy. It could end in disaster with the planning. I mean, obviously it has to be some central planning. But anyway, look,
modern farming and modern marketing is at one level absolutely brilliant. The fact that I've got an allotment, right? And I know a little bit about how difficult it is to produce vegetables at home. But if you go into any of about 4 or 5 supermarkets within a mile of us, you'll not just get lettuce, you'll get about 10 different kinds of lettuce, 10 different kinds of fruit and vegetables, 56, 60, 70 different types of bread. The sheer variety of food that supermarkets are able to provide at incredibly cheap prices, not everybody would agree with you, is a phenomenal miracle of economic management. But it has consequences, as you and I are talking about.
Yeah, well, it would become completely dependent on supermarkets, and they can simply sit as a little cartel and start to price fix if they feel like it. Well, look, let's wind up by just looking at the spiritual side of this, because I think it's, Jack talks about his roots in, I think it's the Congregational Church, or his family's roots anywhere in there, and that's something else which is is almost unmentioned, that this spiritual side to our life today has almost been kind of gotten rid of by TV's dismissing it. I mean, we see his documentaries about, why are we thinking about God? This is silly old stuff. We've got science now to take over. And I wonder what you make of, and Jack made of that side of we've seen these crafts stripping away, the traditional countryside ways stripping away. What about the spiritual life and the changes there?
Well, I think somebody said, I don't know, it was a very fine author, I forget what his name is, bloke who wrote Flaubert's Parrot. He said, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. And then someone else said, Europe is got an enormous God-shaped hole into which every imaginable cult and lunacy emerges because of people's yearning for what you're describing. Now, there was a commandment which said, thou shalt not take the name of God, thy God, in vain. And this is one of the problems about talking about this subject, is that every time I've met people who have faith, I'm not talking about people who say, have you read this verse? And then you will understand, who evangelize. I'm saying that actually discussing things spiritual is actually taking the name of God in vain. And I find that some of the most enjoyable people that I know, and lovely people I know, they don't talk about God. They just know that they know. And they might have a cross around their neck, or they might be some other religion and so on. But they tend to keep that to themselves, and they talk quietly about it rather than talk loudly. Don't get me wrong, because I think that German scholars in the 19th century did a fantastic destruction job on the Bible by going through all the texts and showing how they weren't true and that Christ may not even have existed. And if he did, the Christianity that we know only began to emerge about 1,000 years after Christ, and so on and so forth. So I can understand why people have moved away or moved to, but, well, it's a vast discussion, and I can't say anything very wise about it.
Well, I got the sense from Jack that he had some faith, but that he didn't want to really talk about that directly to the viewers, but that he wanted almost people to sense it from the way he was.
I don't believe in hell. I don't believe in hell, but it terrifies me because, his early upbringing. And I'm absolutely imbued with the Christianity that I learned from childhood, not from my parents specifically, but from school. And I love the stories, and I love being in churches. And I spend a lot of time in Greece, where I have no comprehension of liturgy, but then most of the churchgoers don't either, because it's in a form of Greek that is not generally understood. But I've always been welcomed in the Greek churches, and we're allowed to take communion there. And I enjoy the presence. But Jack said, if I had any religion in mind, I would be a fellow traveller of the Quakers, because what they said is my conscience is the only thing that concerns me. I do not concern myself with other men's consciences.
Well, interesting. Yeah. Well, yes, I'm a Quaker. So that figures. So how do people get hold of Jack's work today? We don't really see it being repeated much on TV, although of course I think it should be such an interesting, important insight into the world around us. And we're supposedly in the middle of this ecological crisis. Of course, Jack was documenting much of the destruction of the countryside, the intrusion of the townies into the countryside. Back in those days, you would have thought that this would be almost like a sort of bestseller today on the TV, but apparently not.
Well, I think there are so many eloquent writers about this, and a lot of people aware of the issue, including farmers who are doing things all over the place, and collating all that, I think, is very difficult. But we see examples of it, and I get that. And I've got a Facebook page called Out of Town with Jack Hargreaves, which has got 5,000 members. And we have lots of members who are townspeople, but also quite a few who are farmers, who are well aware of the issues that we're dealing with here. So they're both involved with the intensification that we've discussed, but also trying to, in their own way, to do something about that. I think there are policymakers who are aware of it. A very simple thing about the fact, where some of the most rare species of flowers have been preserved. Some wise, far-sighted civil servant about 40 years ago said, put them on motorways. And they're on motorway verges, which is one of the most safest habitats you could imagine. You can sometimes see kestrels hovering over them. Yes, they're probably off the smell of diesel and everything else, but motorway verges apparently are now, I'm not going to give any geographical locations, but some of the rarest plants and the rarest habitats in the country are now on motorway verges, of which there are thousands of square miles. So there are the Central
Reservation well, it's a kind of a reservation for wildlife potentially, isn't it?
With all the reservations we have about reservations, but
yeah,
still. But the way you get to see Jack's material is through the work of Network On Air. Tim Beddoes is the chief executive of Network On Air, very successful media company. Tim travels all over the world. He's bought up small cinemas in places to keep cinemas going in South America. He bought up Hammer Films recently, and he's got all their repertoire. But basically, I became friends with him when he met me in North London about 7 years ago. And I was preoccupied with restoring all the out-of-town film that I've got in our garage, and how we should do it. It's silent film with separate tapes of Jack's commentaries. So you've got to digitize it, then you've got to synchronize the sound with the film, and then you've got to put in the beginning and the start. Well, Network On Air have a website where if you put in Jack Hargreaves, you'll see the full repertoire. There are other places on the web where you can get Jack Hargreaves broadcasts, but the full repertoire of what's available of his film, including the ones that we're now restoring, is on the Network On Air website as DVDs. And of course, that's a dying technology, but sometimes people really want to hold something in their hands and have something that they can put on a shelf, just like I like to have a book.
It's just like having a hardback or a paperback book rather than some sort of digital file, isn't it? You know that it's there. I mean, this is the problem. Computer says no sometimes, doesn't it? And I think the idea of actually having something physical with the media that you've got yourself is actually quite important. So
but now you've got Joe Rogans of this world have got more viewers than CNN. Broadcasting is going down the tubes, as it were, literally, because what people are listening to now are their choice, and you can get them left, right, across the political spectrum of podcasters and people with their own channels. If Jack was alive today, he would be doing a global podcast from a little boutique studio in his cottage, watched by millions. And I know a few people like this. There's a lovely bloke who's actually a butcher who talks about cooking and cutting up meat and serving it and so on. And he every now and again he gets 1 million hits, and this is on a podcast. How to cook a lamb, how to, from the time when you pick it from the herd to slaughter it and then take it right through with appropriate warnings with the slaughter, which isn't horrible, but there it is. And he can handle a drone, he can handle a camera, and he's got a wonderful gift of the gab. And he's podcasting, and I find I watch that with great fascination and much more interesting. And Lynn and I, although we do still pay the TV license, probably won't be doing it much longer, because all our viewing and that of our family is on a computer now, whether it looks like a television or not.
Yeah, so I mean, there are one or two people. I think if you're just thinking about people who are doing a similar job today to what Jack was doing, do you think there's anyone you'd like to mention?
Well, there's a kind of Savorano. Was it called Savorano? Who was the name of the Italian fanatic? Savonarola. Forget it. But a lot of these people are preaching to townspeople about life in the country. I think wouldn't name names, but they often don't really know about the details of the country life. That Jack was so detailed in his comprehension and understanding of what went on in the countryside, and in his cosmopolitan understanding of the demographic implications and the economic implications. And he was inevitably compromised because he was one of the very people with many of the habits that actually leading to the problems and the blighting that we're talking about. Yes, he relied on cars, and yes, he bought a cottage in the country and did it up, and yet he was deeply into television, media, advertising, and the cosmopolitan life. But I don't think that there's any broadcast country program. If I want to see good country programs, I'll go to podcasts. where there'll be somebody who has got an idea about fell ponies, for instance, or a specialist interest in rearing particular breeds of pigs. And you'll find there are special, I mean, people say, oh, there's nothing to watch on television. And I say, well, stop watching television. Go on the internet and look for specialist subjects that fascinate you. And you'll find that there are eccentric, interesting, intelligent, smart people with quite small numbers of viewers who are talking about country life in all sorts of interesting and sometimes contrarian ways.
Well, I came across a writer who's also a farmer called John Lewis Stemple recently. He writes for various different outlets, including
Brilliant.
It was actually the Mail. Is one of his new books about sheep was being serialized, but he one of his recent articles is called "Why Britain Needs a Peasants' Revolt." William Cobbett's dream of a brave old world, and what he's doing, I think, there is very similar to Jack, actually, in picking out some of the best of the new and the best of the old. And it's nice to think that there are still people who make that distinction, that it's not all good where we're heading, it's not all bad where we're heading, that you've got to get a kind of blend of both. Anyway, Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. And I hope it's also a pleasure for our viewers, listeners here to catch up on Jack Hargreaves if they've not done so over the last many years. In fact, it's funny, isn't it? You mention how the name Jack Hargreaves to pretty much anyone of our age, they will remember the TV children's program How, which he was involved in. They used to put their hand up like this, didn't they? It was kind of a Native American thing. I mean, it's an incredible legacy he's left us, and I think in a way prophetic, looking at the damage that there has been, an intensification in the countryside, and the fact that we as a people, not just the townies, the country people too, are becoming so distant from the basic things that we need to carry on and survive in this world. That is, getting something to eat as becoming almost like a process which was far too removed from. Thanks ever so much for joining us, and thank you also for sharing all the work that you're doing in making sure that this.
Thank you for such a lot of intelligent and interesting observations and questions. I love talking about this, and I probably talk too much. Lynn would be saying this. She said, "This isn't fair. You've taken over my kitchen." So I apologise now on air to Lynn, who's sitting opposite me, waiting for us to disappear.
Okay, Simon, thanks very much for joining us.
God bless.